those are two different issues. One issue is the vehicle. The other issue is the ideology or the policies. In other words, there's an institutional question. What will be the institution that will carry forward some of the needs of the South, etc.? And the other is, what will be the basic ideological platform? How will it be grounded? The institutional question is one that's on the table now. People have started to discuss it. In fact, in maybe 2003, at the Cancun meeting, where discussions about agriculture came up, India, Brazil and South Africa first created a combination. And actually, their combination was not about agriculture, it was about medicines, pharmaceuticals. Because South Africa was facing very high cost for AIDS drugs. And India was able to produce AIDS drugs at a very low cost. But because of the intellectual property regime, which is one of the main ways, we can talk about that if you like, one of the main ways in which the North has been able to maintain some economic power. Because of that intellectual property regime in general, they were not able to sell their cheap drugs. This goes back to the 1980s. It's a very interesting story about how intellectual rights changed. Up to the 1980s, what was patented was the process, not the product. So if you came to the product from a different process, you could do it. So you could so-called reverse engineer a drug, a medicine. And you could produce the same medicine if you used a different process. So what was patented was a process. In the 1980s, the North fought to change the logic of patents. So what was patented was the product. So even if you came to this medicine from a totally ingenious way, you couldn't sell it without paying rent to the firm that controlled the patent. So India, Brazil, South Africa created the IBSA group. That's the emergence of a new institutional foundation. And then after the financial crisis of 07-08, the IBSA group anchored with now Russia and China. In a way, I'm shortening the story, and they become BRICS. And BRICS has had annual meetings. So they have created some institutional space as the most demographically and economically powerful countries of the South to make a claim, in world affairs. That's an institutional move. Obviously, they are divided from, the LDCs, the less developed countries. They are divided from, 170 odd countries that are not part of the BRICS formation. But yet, they have pretension of being institutional leaders, the space. That's different from the ideology. Having created some institutional space, what are you going to propose? What are your new ideas? And there are no new ideas right now that have been firmly articulated. The main concepts of the BRICS are also, useful, but they don't have a fullness, like regionalism. It's a very important idea. Regions should have some integrity. Fine. Multilateralism. In other words, not bilateral. America does treaties with Mexico. America does treaties with... No, multilateral. Have a much broader, so that small, vulnerable countries are not stuck in a bilateral negotiation with a very powerful country. Have it where the power is now diffused a little bit. These are good principles, but these are not new policies. What will be the new policies? And thus far, we've reached the point where we have some institutions, we have some basic principles for the world, multilateral, regional, but we don't have coherent policies, and we don't have even the foundation of those policies. And so that will be the next phase, is to fight out, create a foundation for new policies, and then create new policies themselves. It's important to have as many public events as possible, and not just because those who are already part of the discussion should talk to each other. I mean, the real issue is that the vast majority of people on the planet are terrified of economics. They are not interested in these discussions, because even though these discussions are life or death issues, but the way in which people have these conversations, they pretend to be technical. They pretend to speak in a language where they say, well, you just simply cannot understand what I'm talking about. Actually, we need to change that, the burden of proof here. If you are going to set rules for economic activity, which everybody contributes toward, then the rules have to be set in a process which is legible, so that people whose money is being taken from them, and I can explain what that means, should be part of the process. They should not be kept out of the process because now you've said they're illiterate and only experts should decide. That's a very dangerous kind of world, because that's absolutely antithetical to the democratic principle. So the reason public events are important is that we need to have broad discussions, not in highly technical language, which often masquerades, Highly technical language, if you break it down, if you understand the language, often nothing is said. I can understand some of the highly technical language. I'll sit through a conversation and I'm amazed how banal the presentation was. But because it comes in highly technical language, people are in awe and think, wow, this is very interesting. End of the day, all this person said is that poor countries should be grateful that rich countries, give them aid. But they don't say it. They'll put it in all kinds of esoteric mechanisms. So people sit back and go, let this person be, the next head of the World Bank. But they've said something that's obnoxious. They've dressed it up. So public symposium should not just be a public symposium. There should be an obligation for people who have the responsibility to frame rules, it should be a burden on them to make public the broad principles of what they're doing. And I'm afraid even though we do a public symposia, we don't say the obligation is on us to become transparent. We talk a lot about transparency, but what is not transparent is how trade rules are framed. They are framed ruthlessly and they are framed under cover of language that need not be, so difficult. Okay, firstly, you should not need a background in economics. I go in an election and I vote for somebody. I may not have a background. You don't say to everybody going into the voting booth, you should have a background in political science. You should have a background in government theory. We don't say to everybody who's going to cook an omelette in the kitchen in the morning, have you taken a course in nutrition or in culinary arts? Every cook can cook. Everybody can make a cup of tea. You don't have to go to school for that. Why must you have background in economics to understand how people are discussing the framing of trade rules? Especially in a public symposium, which is different from a technical workshop on some specific entity. Young people are going to have to inherit this world. And why should they inherit a world where they are alienated from some of the most important issues of our time? Poverty, etc. People might have a position, a moral position, saying, I'm against poverty. They have a moral position saying, I'm against this or that. That's a very good, important opening. If you are morally against the existence of poverty, then you've already entered the room. Now the question is, it is up to me. The responsibility is on me to make it plain to you what are the 15 different approaches to poverty reduction today. If I am unable to tell you that, I should not be responsible for framing rules on how poverty should be reduced. Young people are the future. Young people are not a burden. Young people are not somebody that you say, look, you just don't get it, so let the adults frame this. It's the same way as saying let the experts deal with it. It's an undemocratic approach. Nothing is complicated. People say derivatives, it's so complicated. Actually, they're not complicated. What's complicated is the actual derivative that was constructed. But the idea of derivatives is not complicated. It's a very elementary thing. So one of the ways in which people are alienated from these discussions, and then they say, look, all I'm going to do is, I'm going to read, what's happening over here, some celebrity. This is not because people are lazy. It's because a terrain of economic thinking, a terrain of social life, economic activity, has become purposefully, in a sense, censorious, censors people because it says you don't get what's going on. That should not be the way. The way should be is people who frame policies should also be teachers. They need to be having an argument with people on first principles. This is the nature of the policy we are framing. Not, we are framing a policy and it's a technical issue. There are always first principles. And powerful people are loath to discuss first principles. What they would like to do is to say, we are against poverty and we've developed a strategy called poverty reduction strategy. Then you ask them, what is the guiding principles of your strategy? They will get upset. They will say, I just told you I'm against poverty. The issue is everybody's against poverty. Nobody on the planet is for poverty. Some heartless people maybe. Everybody, so it's hardly a principle to be against poverty. The principle is, do you want to have some welfare payment so people just survive on essentially life support? Or do you want to create a society where people are able to contribute in different ways? How are you going to do it? What are your principles to end poverty? Nobody likes to talk about that, because then it becomes clear that even though they are against poverty, they don't have a strategy to actually eradicate poverty. They have a strategy to manage poverty. So they're actually not against poverty, even though that's what they say. So that's what I mean by it's an obligation for people who frame principles and laws to articulate honestly what are their principles. And that means that they should be able to talk to young people, people who have no background in economics. Everybody has a right to know what the principles are for the laws that are being framed. I mean, I don't know, because I didn't organize the symposium. That is when somebody organizes something, they have some outcomes in mind. My outcome was to come here and to produce, a certain view of what I think the future should look like. I have a certain view. I believe very strongly that, I believe that we have societies today where people are working very hard and nothing is for them. So I believe in a concept called the social wage, which I think is completely forgotten today. If I'm a worker in a sector where I'm receiving wages, some of the wages goes in taxation to a fund. Okay? Then there are people like, say I'm a housewife, say. I'm not working because I'm not going out and collecting a wage. On the other hand, I'm forfeiting my wage because I'm raising children in society. I'm also in a negative way contributing to that fund. You understand? Somebody's directly, their wage is being taxed. Another is saying, I forfeit my wage. I'll work for free. That means they've contributed to that fund. There's a very large fund in every society. Some of it is real money going in. Some is the money that people say, I will not take. I'll work for free. They may volunteer. They do all kinds of work to improve society. Volunteerism is a form of taxation. In other words, I will give you my time. I don't give you part of my wage. That is a fund. That is a social wage. Now, what has happened in the last 50 years or so is that governments claim that social wage to be something that they have the right to. So, as firms started to show up in a city, one city and another city will start competing to keep the firm. So, one city will say, we'll give you land free, we'll give you water free for 2 years. The other city will say, we'll give you electricity free. In other words, what these governments are doing is they are using the social wage and they are taking deferred compensation, money that people have said, I won't take now. I'll give you this tax or I won't take any wage. And they are giving that to firms rather than using that money to better people's lives. And that, I think, is a scandal that we treat as normal. People say that I don't want to pay tax. I don't blame them. But there are also people who volunteer work. They pay tax by not taking. All this money should be put to the betterment of people's lives. And that is the kind of argument that I would like to see take place. That it's not a question of let's give aid to people. People are working hard. They are not being compensated for what they're doing. Their compensation is going to big firms. That is a scandal. So the language, the discussion has to change. It should not be about welfare or aid or things like that. It should be about people are rightfully already working. Many of them are not being monetarily compensated, but the world is theirs. They are making the world. Somebody who goes and volunteers for 6-7 hours in a library has made the world better, has helped people, educate themselves. They are working hard. Just because they don't take compensation. There are women around the world, because of the gender division of labor, that are raising children. They're working very hard, but there is no fruit. of the social wealth that comes to them. They may be reviled and they may be treated as second-class citizens. Oh, where do you work? Oh, you raise children. Oh, well, people have this attitude toward that, but they are working and they are contributing to the social wage. We need to change how we see economies. That is my personal mission. Is I come to these events to argue that theme. That just because a firm exists doesn't mean it's more powerful than ordinary people working to make the world a better place. That's the issue. I mean, the problem isn't the border. Human beings also have borders against each other. We are not all one glob. I am me, you are you, but we are able to deal with each other. Some people are not able to deal with each other. It's not a paradise. But the problem isn't that you have an embodied existence and I have an embodied existence. States have embodied existences. The problem is the way rules are constructed that either facilitate the maintenance of borders or that abolish borders. So, for instance, during the era of globalization, capital flows, the movement of capital across borders was pushed strongly, so that money should be able to go from one country to the other without restrictions. That was liberalization of the financial sector. At the same time, the very north, United States, Europe, that was championing liberalization of capital flows, was strengthening the immigration policies. Putting higher walls around their countries. United States, in fact, built a giant wall on the Rio Grande. Okay? So the question isn't, open borders. No, it was a specific way in which borders should be annulled, but another way borders should be strengthened. Okay? So the question isn't, are borders good or bad? The embodied nature of a nation is not the problem. The problem is how the border is treated across nations. How policies are framed to bring people to have an easier existence with each other. To facilitate the wants of ordinary people, the aspirations of ordinary people. If that's your immediate proximate principle, then the issue of borders or no borders is not the main issue. The main issue is so when they framed laws which liberalized capital flow and tightened immigration flow, essentially what these countries were saying is money is more important than a human being. Because money should be allowed to go anywhere, but human beings have to be penalized. They cannot cross, this is a ridiculous idea. When you open trade regimes through NAFTA, the immediate movement of, Midwestern, American, US corn into Mexico destroyed the Mexican corn industry. Very important part of Mexican agriculture. Displaced hundreds of thousands of people who then moved north for employment. But then they are stopped, penalized at the border, or they become illegal and then work for subpar wages. So you've allowed liberalization of trade, but not liberalization of people's movement. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, borders are not the real issue. The real issue is the policies framed that either link people or improve the condition of their lives.